Coming up on Arirang News, South Korea plans to downsize its military by about 79,000 troops in the coming years as the country's population starts to shrink. The smaller force will be supplemented by advanced technology. The Assistant U.S. Secretary of State, David Stilwell, is in Seoul. It's thought he wants to convince South Korea not to cancel its military intelligence sharing pact with Japan. And the South Korean government announces new price ceilings on homes in Seoul, where rampant speculation has been driving prices sky high. It's 4:00 p.m. here in Seoul. Thanks for tuning in to Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs David Stilwell is in Seoul for a series of meetings with South Korean officials. His visit's drawn more attention than it might normally do because a joint military intel sharing pact between Seoul and Tokyo is set to expire within weeks, and it's a deal Washington wants extended. For more, we have our Kim Min-ji on the line. Min-ji, what's the latest?
Devin, Assistant Secretary of State David Stilwell was at Seoul's Defense Ministry for talks with South Korean officials, including Deputy Defense Minister Chung Seok-hwan. Now, upon arriving, he said he has had fantastic discussions today on topics of agreement. Now, that's the response he gave as reporters asked whether GSOMIA, a military intel sharing pact between South Korea and Japan, came up during his sit-down with Seoul's foreign minister earlier this morning. Now, we don't know for sure if it was a direct response to the GSOMIA question, but what we do know is that Washington does want this pact extended. Now, in fact, a lot of attention has been on the message Stilwell will deliver regarding Seoul's decision to pull out of the intel sharing pact with Tokyo. Just to give you some background, in August, Seoul decided not to extend the pact in response to Japan's economic retaliation over a court ruling ordering Japanese firms to compensate South Korean victims of Japan's wartime forced labor. Now, it was widely speculated that Stilwell would urge South Korea to retract its decision, citing the importance of trilateral security cooperation.
Now, Min-ji, we understand that Stilwell met with Seoul's foreign minister and vice minister earlier today. Was anything significant addressed there?
Well, Stilwell told reporters after the meetings that key issues in their bilateral relationship were discussed. He didn't answer questions regarding GSOMIA, but something to note is that he stressed that the U.S. sees the meeting between President Moon Jae-in and Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe as an encouraging sign. Now, Moon and Abe had a roughly 10-minute conversation on the sidelines of ASEAN meetings in Bangkok a couple of days back. Stilwell also emphasized that South Korea-U.S. alliance is the linchpin of peace and security in the Indo-Pacific region. So there hasn't been any public pressure from Washington as of yet, but there's speculation that the issue was brought up during their closed-door discussions. That's all I have for now. Back to you, Devin.
All right, Kim Min-ji reporting from the Foreign Ministry. Thank you. Meanwhile, officials from South Korea and the U.S. have signed a joint statement on how they can work together to strengthen ties with Southeast Asian countries. Seoul's second Vice Foreign Minister, Lee Tae-ho, met with Keith Krach, an Undersecretary on Economic Affairs from the U.S. State Department in Seoul this morning. They discussed ways to bolster economic ties with countries in South Asia and the Indo-Pacific region, in line with South Korea's new Southern policy and the Indo-Pacific strategy of the U.S. In a joint statement, the two countries laid out a set of detailed plans to achieve that goal, including joint efforts in development, infrastructure, energy, and digital connectivity. South Korea has again proposed working-level talks with North Korea about tours to Geumgangsan Mountain. Seoul's Unification Ministry says it notified the North on Tuesday of its plan to send a delegation of government and business officials for a meeting about North Korea's demand that South Korea remove its facilities from the mountain resort. They would also inspect the facilities in the area. Seoul first proposed holding the talks around a week ago, but Pyongyang rejected the idea, preferring to negotiate in writing. The South Korean government's reportedly looking at how to go about discussing the matter through both face-to-face talks and in writing, should Pyongyang turn down the offer again. Japan has reportedly rejected a suggestion from South Korea's parliamentary speaker, Moon Hee-sang, about a way to resolve their dispute over compensation for wartime forced labor. Japanese broadcaster NHK, citing a government source, said a majority of the Abe administration disagrees with Moon's proposal because it's based on the premise that Japanese firms would pay compensation. Moon had suggested a day earlier that compensation would be funded voluntarily by the citizens and companies of both sides. But the NHK report said Japan is not likely to accept any proposal requiring Tokyo to pay, reiterating Prime Minister Abe's comments earlier this week. After months of pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong, China has made clear that it's not going to tolerate any threat to its control over the city. Kim Da-mi has the details.
China has invoked and will enforce policies to strengthen its grip over Hong Kong. China's state-run Xinhua news agency reported Tuesday that the Chinese government made the decision at the 4th plenary session of the 19th Communist Party of China Central Committee held in Beijing last month. Beijing makes it clear that Hong Kong will always be a part of China under its one country, two systems, and will not accept any challenge that threatens that. In addition, Beijing said the district chief executives, including Hong Kong's Carrie Lam, will fully be responsible and obedient to the Chinese government. Appointment and dismissal systems and the structure of special administrative officers, including chief executives, will also be revised and perfected. The Chinese Communist Party also stressed that Beijing will exercise full control and legal adjustments over these special administrative zones in accordance with the Constitution and Basic Law in order to boost patriotism in Hong Kong and Macau and to prevent intervention, division, and destruction due to foreign forces. Analysts note China's new plans lay the groundwork for Beijing to forcefully crack down on Hong Kong's fight for greater democracy in the near future. Kim Da-mi, Arirang News.
South Korean director Park Chan-wook has won the Film and Beyond Award at the 25th Geneva International Film Festival. The prize is given out annually to highly accomplished and experienced directors. The festival organizers said Tuesday that they chose Park for his accomplishments across the film industry. They also described him as one of the most influential filmmakers in South Korea. 5 of Park's films, including The Handmaiden and Thirst, will be screened in Geneva for this year's festival, which runs through Sunday. South Korea's current account posted a surplus for the 5th consecutive month in September, but on year the figure was down by more than 30%. The Bank of Korea says the surplus in September was $7.5 billion US. That's still the highest figure in 11 months. The central bank attributed the on-year decline, though, to lower prices for key exports, including chips and petrochemical goods. South Korea's services account recorded a deficit of $2.5 billion. South Korea's population will soon start shrinking. To prepare for that, defense-wise, the government plans to cut the number of troops in the military and supplement their numbers with more advanced technology. The government's also planning to boost innovation and flexibility in the economy through steps like deregulation. Yoon Jung-min reports.
The South Korean government plans to cut the number of troops to 500,000 by 2022, a reduction of 79,000 from the current level. In a meeting with economy-related ministers on Wednesday, Finance Minister Hong Nam-gi said the government will reorganize the current military system and use new technology to prepare for the decreasing number of soldiers due to demographic changes. The government also plans to increase the number of female soldiers from the current 6% to 8.8% in the next 3 years, while reviewing whether to make military service mandatory for naturalized Koreans. Under the current law, all able-bodied Korean men must serve around 2 years in the military. Naturalized Korean citizens, however, can decide whether or not to serve. At the meeting, the finance minister also announced plans to reorganize the country's economy through deregulation, public sector innovation, and increasing flexibility and security in the labor market. The minister hinted that the government will give more support to future industries, and details will be included in next year's government economic plan. To revitalize the country's slowing economy, the government will help local exporters by supporting Korean wave marketing with more financial support to promote goods and services related to K-pop, K-beauty, and games. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
Big changes coming to South Korea's real estate market. The government's just revealed the districts where new price ceilings will be imposed to clamp down on rampant speculation. Our Hong Yu has the details.
The Ministry of Land, Infrastructure and Transport said on Wednesday that the newly adjusted price ceiling system on privately owned housing sites will be applied to 27 neighborhoods in Seoul. Most of these neighborhoods are in the 4 districts in the southeast of the city, as well as 2 neighborhoods in Yongsan-gu and 1 each in Mapo-gu, Seongdong-gu and Yeongdeung-po-gu districts. For these areas, the price of homes has to be less than the appraised value of the housing added with the construction cost. This time, the system has been applied to pinpointed areas where the housing market is overheated, instead of being applied to the entire country like has been the case in the past.
Low interest rates and ample market liquidity have recently pushed up demand in the Seoul housing market amid growing economic uncertainties. The price of new apartments in Seoul has quadrupled over the past year, fueling a rise in the price of existing homes.
The minister Kim Hyun-mi explained this is why the government has revised the price ceiling system to break the vicious cycle of rising house prices. The criteria for the price ceiling were districts that have witnessed a big price spike this year, Seoul districts that have contributed to overheating markets and have new housing developments planned, and districts that postponed releasing newly built houses to the market to drive up prices. Experts say the government used a 2-track strategy of clamping down on the overheated housing market with the price ceiling system, while lifting restrictions on areas where the housing market has been stagnant for a long time. Hong Yu, Arirang News.
Time now for an in-depth look at the market news this afternoon, and for that I'm joined on the line by Dr. Yang Jun-seok, professor of economics at the Catholic University of Korea. Dr. Yang, thank you for coming on today.
Happy to be here.
So we have some positive news on the U.S. China trade war, both sides saying that as part of the Phase 1 deal, they're looking at getting rid of some of the tariffs. How are the markets doing today with regard to that news and otherwise?
Okay, well, ever since both U.S. and China said that the negotiations are going well, the global markets have rallied. Now, the most important element in the global rally seems to be that the U.S. and China are successfully working things out. But in the case of the United States, their economic news has actually been very good. Their job creation numbers are more than twice as high as most analysts had predicted. And so the S&P index hit historical highs earlier this week. And in Europe, while the outlook is still gloomy, some figures came out, again, somewhat better than what analysts expected, even though it wasn't a great big surprise. They're taking any good news that they can get, so those are the reasons why the European and American markets have rallied. Asian markets have done fairly well as well, and that's probably because they just announced the agreement on the RCEP, the mega FTA project.
Right. Well, the Korea Development Institute has studied the U.S.-China trade war and estimated that if they were to implement all the tariffs they've announced, it would hit Korea's GDP growth by 1/3%. What do you think about that? And if true, what can Korea do about it?
Okay, well, luckily, as we just mentioned, the U.S. and China does seem to be coming to an agreement on the so-called Phase 1 agreement. Phase 1 agreement. Now, the problem with that, though, is that even though both U.S. and China are playing up this deal, it's actually what we called a few months ago a small deal, which means that the fundamental issues of industrial policy, subsidies will probably not be dealt with that much. What will be dealt in this particular agreement would be things like, on the U.S. side, cutting tariffs and perhaps delaying some of the additional tariffs that are scheduled to go in December. And then on the China side, they would agree to buy more agricultural products from the United States. They would agree to some loosening of limits on American firms working in China, and some additional, probably not major, but still some strengthening of the IPR, intellectual property protections. So in a sense, it's not going to be a really great big deal. So perhaps the market is overreacting to the news. But it's good news nevertheless, and that means that from Korea's side, that 0.38% decline that KDI was worried about will probably not take place, at least not in that level. And given that Korea's growth rate right now is only going to be about 2%, even that 0.3% will be a big deal for Korea's growth rates. But what can Korea do about it? We can't really do anything about the global markets, but we can do something about the domestic market. Now, Korea, compared to other advanced countries, are a proportion of exports and GDP is very high. It's somewhere between, depending on the year, 43% to 48%. The only other advanced country which has that higher proportion of exports in the GDP is Germany. And even in Germany, a lot of what they export is actually to other European Union countries, so it's within the same economic zone. So Korea is really, compared to other advanced countries, our share of exports is really very high. And so we need to perhaps expand the share of domestic demand in our total demand. And at least on the domestic side, we have some control over the domestic demand by using policies like fiscal, government expenditure policies, and monetary policies. So that's what I think we should really be focused on. We can't do much about the global economy. I know that the government is trying to put some more money into export promotion, trying to get more, make it easier for exporters. But I think our real focus should be on domestic demand.
Got it. Well, staying with trade, according to the Bank of Korea, in September, the country posted a current account surplus, smaller, though, than a year earlier. What do you see in this figure?
Okay, well, the press is treating the current account news as good news because we have a current account surplus. It's just about $7.5 billion, and it's been the highest in 11 months, though it is lower than the figure that we had in last September. However, if you look more closely at the numbers, they're not very healthy. Not only did our exports fell, but also our imports have fallen as well, and that's usually not good news because that means our domestic demand is very weak. And again, because our domestic demand is very weak, we can't really look forward to a recovery. Part of that reduction in imports are due to lower oil prices, and that's good for Korea. But also part of that lowered imports come from the fact that Koreans are just not buying. They're not buying Korean goods or they're not buying imported goods. So this seems to indicate that the slowdown of the Korean economy will be with us for a while.
Very interesting discussion. All right, Dr. Young, we'll have to leave it there for today. Thanks for your insights.
Thank you.
Now, hopes are rising, as we mentioned, that the world's two biggest economies are moving closer to ending their trade war with phase one of a deal under which they'd start getting rid of some of their tariffs. Our Kim Jae-hee has more.
The Wall Street Journal reported on Tuesday that the U.S. and China are actively considering withdrawing some tariffs. A senior Trump administration official was quoted as saying removing tariffs will be part of it if the U.S. and China reach a trade deal. Washington and Beijing agreed in principle last month to end the trade conflict. The Phase 1 trade deal would include China's purchase of American agriculture goods and rules to deter currency manipulation. It would also contain methods to protect U.S. intellectual property in exchange for freezing tariff increases on hundreds of billions of dollars of Chinese goods. The U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross made positive remarks regarding the matter on Tuesday, saying that good progress was being made towards completing the Phase 1 trade deal. China's foreign ministry also sent out positive signals, saying the two leaders have maintained continuous contact.
On October 25th, the heads of the two teams agreed in a telephone call to properly address each other's core concerns and affirmed that technical consultations on part of the text had basically been completed. They will have another telephone call shortly. In the meantime, working-level consultations will be continued at a fast pace.
This is also in line with President Trump's recent optimistic remarks.
We are looking probably to be ahead of schedule to sign a very big portion of the China deal. And we'll call it Phase 1, but it's a very big portion.
With the trade war between the world's two biggest economies going on for more than a year, hopes are high among global markets for a trade deal to be reached as early as this month. Kim Jae-hee, Arirang News.
The explosive sales of the latest iPhone, which does not support 5G, show that 4G or LTE phones haven't lost their appeal just yet. 5G models have been released this year in Korea, but local telecom firms are offering massive discounts on LTE handsets from companies like Samsung and LG. The price for Samsung's latest flagship Galaxy S10 has been slashed by roughly $260 for the LTE version. Telecom firms this year have also been focusing on selling 5G models with discounts of up to $500. Data show these days the vast majority of Korea's biggest companies are run by professional business managers rather than family owners like in the past. According to a study by CEO Score, professional managers are in charge of 83% of the country's top 500 companies. The figure's been rising steadily in the period studied since 2012, when it was at 77%. A little under half of the CEOs were recruited from within their companies. For those scouted from outside, the most popular source for them was Samsung at 15.5%. These days, we're constantly tapping away on our smartphones or holding them in our hands, which inevitably means the phones have germs on them. But just how dirty are they? Not to mention elevator buttons, for example, which are touched by countless strangers all day long. Park Chan-wook takes a closer look.
Elevator buttons are pressed by people all the time, and people spend their days glued to their smartphones. This is why a local research team investigated the cleanliness of around 40 smartphones, 140 elevator buttons, and some 30 ATMs. The study found pathogens which can cause serious infections in humans on the surface of every device.
Comparing the surface of a toilet lid with that of an elevator button, the study found that the elevator button had as many microbes as the toilet lid.
Smartphones hosted more types of microorganisms, while elevator buttons were home to the highest number of microorganisms per square centimeter. In case of elevator buttons, the hygiene of frequently used buttons like the first floor and door control buttons were far worse. With smartphones, more germs were found in the sweaty months of August and September. Exposure to these germs is unlikely to affect adults with a normal immune system, but children and the elderly should be more careful. And researchers advise refraining from touching the eyes, nose, and mouth after using contact-type devices. Park Se-young, Arirang News.
Once the weather is freezing cold day after day, that's when Koreans start traditionally making huge batches of their world-famous spicy side dish kimchi. The cold helps kimchi ferment properly, but this year that time will come 2 to 4 days later than last year. Forecasters at Korea's weather agency advise people in Seoul to start making kimchi on December 3rd, followed by Daejeon on December 5th, Daegu on the 8th of the month, and Busan on January 4th. Temperatures, they say, before then will be too mild. Experts say these days the best time for making kimchi is almost 2 weeks later than it was 100 years ago in the 1920s. And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.